did well. So before the power went off, I had only 3 things to say, which I want just to summarize. One, we appreciate that you consider, you help us to understand that elephant fighting that was made by our people, whether from Africa or from outside, and especially using the case of the Yoruba, that those texts are very important in the reconstruction of our histories. Number 2, you have clearly connected the issues of the early life, the transition from the past to the modern, using different media, forms of media, but their letters, their pictures, their diaries, especially the different types of print media, others that were written by hand that we need to read them and move on. And finally, you have clearly told us that our hero has been using these texts and has been encouraging us to use that form of information to understand African reality. Your use of KENYATTA is a good example, and the concept of origi and others, the eternalities and all that, has really helped us conceptualize that period of history. And with that, I want to call upon our discussant today, Dr. Biegon, to proceed from there so that they can take the question, and then so that they can give his viewpoint on the same. Thank you, Professor David Karim Baba.
Thank you very much, Chair of Session, for heavily steering us during this time. And of course, for bringing us back to the topic and after we have worked. I hope everybody online is following and we have there. Thank you, colleagues and friends and fellow scholars attending this session. First, I'll start with a disclaimer that I'm not, by no means, I'm going to Yoruba, I'm a historian, particular interest in Kenya, and therefore I cannot claim to be able to respond adequately to the very weighty issues that have been raised by Professor Karim Baba. Professor Karim Baba, we thank you for honoring us with your presence. We thank you for speaking to us, and we thank you for raising very weighty and fascinating issues that I am aware have been the focus of your intellectual life for many years. And also for linking your work with our celebrant, Professor Toyin Falola. We are meeting today, and on whose honor we are presenting papers and speaking about Africa and the issues concerning the African condition. So when I saw this topic, Professor Baba's topic, I asked myself 4 questions. But these 4 questions have been mainly asked. I will post them anyway. So the title was Early Yoruba Intellectuals. The title was given. And my first question was, what do we mean by early Yoruba intellectuals? What kind of intellectuals they? How are they formed? And what is their object? Some would ask, what is their project? But the presentation by Professor Karen Baba has obviously answered some of these questions, and it has raised new questions, which I will frame towards the end of my discussion. Just allow me to make a brief point that supports what Professor Karen Baba has presented. And this point will borrow heavily from two eminent Kenyan scholars, Professor Benjamin Bush and Professor Odera Obuka. These two scholars have identified two graph categories of intellectuals and how these intellectuals came to the Kenyans. And it appears that the description given by these scholars in their writings will here very much with the very deep presentation that we have had today of the Yoruba. These two categories of intellectuals are described, one as guild scholars, that is being good in his many writings, but more particularly in his autobiography, My Footprints in the Sand of China. Sage philosophers who are described usually by Henry Oruka, the late, in his book Sage Philosophy, Indigenous Thinkers and Modern Debate on African Philosophy. So, while I'm aware of the danger of binaries, allow me to say something a little about these two categories, and it will become clear at the end of it why I think this research in Kenyan context is important, and why I think it is very much related to some of the points that have been made by Professor Baba. So the guild or African scholars, or guild African scholars identified so by the court. And those of us who are seated here, the word guild is borrowed from the English context. So, what are the characteristics that Ogot gives us of these guild scholars? Their origins are in colonial education, usually the missionary or the colonial government sponsored education. Most of them were trained in Western canons of learning with heavy emphasis on rationality or rationalization, which we know originates in the age of Renaissance and Enlightenment in Europe. The use of language and vocabulary of science that usually has its origin in the West. The method of storing knowledge or writing, which is usually accessible only to a limited audience, and this will usually be a privileged few. And the issues they are concerned with tend to be translocal, meaning beyond their locality, or transnational, meaning beyond their nations. So these are the people B.A. Ogot calls guild scholars. And I think we are guilty as charged. We belong to this category of people who consider ourselves to have gained Western education in the Western academy. And this is the origin that is described by Ogot. What about this second category of philosophers called sage philosophers by Henry Odera Oruka? His description of this in his book, Sage Philosophy, published in 1992, is that this kind of scholars are located in their own communities, usually ethnic groups. They have a long and rooted existence within their own communities.
They have gained their primary training and orientation in their own communities. They use language and vocabulary that is understood in its local context. Their methods of storing knowledge are local and accessible, usually within that context. And their primary concerns are with the issues around their environment. And finally, these kind of sage philosophers usually have attained an ability to think critically and reflexively about their own culture. And Odera Oruka gives examples. Paulo Mbuya, the elderly Luo colonial chief, and Samuel Ayany, who are also among the Luo in Siaya. It appears that the African sage philosopher and the Guild scholar in the African Academy, while both claiming mastery of knowledge, both have their origin, but their origins are different, even though you may allow for some intersections between these two. They seem to occupy parallel planes of knowledge creation and the use of knowledge, and they seem to have different objects, or what you call different projects. These are different. The work of Professor Andrew Odera Oruka and another scholar that I would add, Professor Atieno Odhiambo, whom I'm sure both Professor Falola and Professor Baba would be aware of. The works of these scholars seem to have been dedicated to bringing the sage philosopher by Odera Oruka and the Guild philosopher by B.A. Ogot into some kind of communication, into some kind of a talk. That the people, the philosophers, the sage philosophers who claim indigenous knowledge, who are rooted in their context, who appear to have a different objective in pursuing the creation and use of knowledge, that it seems that these kind of people have something to say to the Guild scholar. These writings by these eminent scholars from Kenya seem to speak very closely to what we have heard today from Professor Karin Baba. And also, Toyin Falola, the man whom we celebrate today, is actively doing this kind of work, as we have learned from many of his publications, not least the Yoruba Gurus, which was presented to us. So my original 4 questions have been partly answered, and let me restate them. The first question as I had was, what do we mean by these early Yoruba intellectuals? In bracket, African intellectuals. What kind of intellectuals are they? How were they formed? And what is their object? That is, what is their project? Now let me go to the new questions that I came with as Professor was presenting, and then I will sit down. There seems to be a suggestion that the knowledge that has been created, the histories that have been published, are only tentative. They are unfinished work, the work that we do in an academy like these as scholars. If this is so, what does this tell us about the state of knowledge or the claim to knowledge that we make? It seems that the work that the current historians and anthropologists, that is the gilded scholars, do need to talk very much with the sage philosophers in order for us to tend towards completing, or at least make some reliable claim about knowledge, whether we think we know what we know. The second question that arose to me was, what does this mean about how we learn? This idea of local intellectuals, the sage philosophers, and local sources that have a deep embeddedness in our own history, but which have nevertheless been hardly used and which are not very commonly used in the academy that we have, that we are stationed in today. So the question there is, what does it mean concerning how we learn things, and probably how we unlearn what we have already learned, given the tentative nature of the histories of the knowledge that we claim to know. And my fourth question would be, where such local intellectuals did not write, and this is the case in very many communities in our own country here, Kenya, but in many African contexts, where you have the local intellectuals who did not necessarily write, but who nevertheless had the authority, had retained deep indigenous knowledge of their own community. What might we suggest? What might the presentation today suggest in terms of methodologies and approaches of engaging with these sources? Because my thinking is that the unpublished knowledge by these sage philosophers is way more than what has been written in the texts that were listed today by the presenter. So what, in terms of methods and approaches, might we think of when we are dealing with these unpublished local intellectuals? Odera Oruka, in his own work, went across this country. He didn't finish the sage philosophy piece, but he went across this country interviewing and documenting information which was given to him by people he considered sages. I would also like to pose a question concerning the new intellectual terrain, which is brought about by the new media, the internet, the so-called artificial intelligence, and this kind of influences that are coming into the field of knowledge. My question here is what do we make of these local intellectuals and the kind of knowledge they had in the face of the new terrain in the intellectual field, which is personified, I think, in artificial intelligence and the internet? And my final request to Professor Karen Baba is, if you can share with us, the younger scholars who are here and our colleagues from Nigeria have joined us here, if you can share with us your own experience in the process of mastering these kinds of sources. What did it take for you in those years? And I know this is a continuing work for you. What did it take for you to master these kind of sources and to bring them to bear in the state, in the creation of knowledge and also the use of knowledge? I wish to end there. Thank you very much, Chairman.
Okay, thank you, everyone. And I want to thank Dr. Biegon, our discussant today, on those insight that he has given us or reflected on the presentation of Professor Madam Baba. So, two key issues that we have had that we need to know who are these Yoruba intellectuals. We want to identify them and their agenda. That is very, very important because, as he has told you, these people were trained in a particular way, were supposed to think in a particular way. And therefore, what they produced is like knowledge in transition, the knowledge that we need to interrogate. And he says we can be able to do that if we use the sage philosopher. That is a mitigation. So he's almost coming up with a methodology on how to critique what those other intellectuals came up with. Then he has ably actually introduced a new area, that is the methodology. So which is the best methodology, given that we even have artificial intelligence coming in, and given that we have IT and others. So which would be the best method to capture this? And then he has challenged our Nigerian scholars and students to help us with coming up with a methodology or sharing the methodology that they have that has enabled them to capture that early histories. The use of those texts, which, as Professor said, represent living realities of the time they were written. So how can we use those living realities of the time to document good authentic history of Africa? We have said that our hero Falola, Toyin, has tried to use that. So those are very key issues that probably need some clarity from the presenter. So before I asked the audience to ask questions to Professor, probably she may make a few comments on this. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Chair. And very many thanks to Eliud for raising such wide-ranging and important questions and for contextualizing the examples I gave so well in relation to Kenyan thinking on similar questions. I found that really, really useful and productive. And in fact, I think it's in keeping with the project of this conference as a whole, because you're bringing together Nigerian and Kenyan intellectual workers, scholars, and encouraging an exchange of perspectives. Now, in relation to local intellectuals or sage philosophers, it seems to me we have a vast potential project here of comparison and of exchange of materials and ideas, which maybe is beginning, but I think there's so many opportunities for people just to compare notes, to look at the kind of local intellectual work that's going on and how local scholars are dealing with it and exploring it. So I think these are totally open questions. I don't think there's an answer. I think we here, these last few days, are in a position to start engaging and producing possible ways forward. And that includes the important question of methodology. There's one point I wanted to perhaps re-emphasize a bit, and that's that if you divide academic or let's say intellectual work into two categories, the guild scholars on the one hand and the sage philosophers on the other, you are in a way missing the opportunity to look at the productivity of the interface, the productivity of the points of contestation, overlap, partial assimilation and partial rejection, which I think, and as I think Professor Falola has brought out in Yoruba Gurus, were really the hallmarks of these early Yoruba writers and thinkers. I mean, take Akinyele. He was a second generation Christian and literate. He was a big man in Ibadan politics. He ended up being the Olubadan, the Oba, the king of Ibadan. He was very, very well connected. His brother was a bishop. So you can't say that he was a sage philosopher in the Odera or Uka sense. He was, in a way, part of a guild, but it wasn't a guild formed by European historiographic conventions and requirements. He was on an interface, and it's on the interface and in times of stress and conflict and contestation that the urgent need to create new things becomes most pressing. And I think that was partly what I was trying to get at, that these people were not repositories of something that already existed or copiers of something that had been brought from somewhere else. They were generating things on the interface. And that's true linguistically as well. They were bilingual, these Yoruba elites. And although they wrote many times a lot in Yoruba and explored the, as Akinyele said, a lot of our history and memory is in the language. You need to know the language to be able to access these historical memories. Nonetheless, they also, as I indicated, all wrote versions of their histories in English, and they translated and they used English sources. So on this linguistic interface, which was incredibly productive in Lagos at this period, and probably beyond Lagos, it's this interstitiality that interests me more than creating two opposed categories and then saying how are we going to get them to talk to each other. As regards method, I would love to know what people who worked on this type of issue have to say about that. In fact, I would say that I'm here really to hear what you've got to say, not to say anything that you guys haven't heard before. So over to you.
Thank you very much, Madam. Professor, as you have responded to his queries or his concerns, and I don't know whether he has something to say. No, he's satisfied. He's satisfied that you can continue with the debates later. Thank you very much. So for now, we are going to continue with the question session and or clarification session. And I think the best way is to start with the group that is here so that we can have a number of questions. And then she responds. And then after that, we go to those that are online. You're welcome to ask questions or to seek clarification. Hello? No one even from Nigeria who understand those. Yes, Chairman. Dr. Gimonde, thank you.
We want to thank Professor Karin Baba for that insightful talk. But I would really wish to hear her comment on the current, status, especially as Dr. Biegon indicated. We talk about these archives and the IT, the emerging media or the emerging media that has become such a threat with the artificial intelligence. What does she foresee the situation evolving into? Thank you.
Okay, a good question is about the current status on the relationship between the archives and the emerging technologies. Okay, another inquiry.
Okay. I would like to know, or I would like the professor to respond on how the Toyin Falola and the Nigerian intellectuals works as Yoruba intellectual impacted the preservation and promotion of Yoruba language and culture.
Okay. He wants to know something about the relationship between Toyin Falola and the Nigerian intellectuals. And then somebody is online. Let him ask his question. That is Professor Omotora Olubuami. Kindly proceed. Professor Omotera Orubuami. Hello. Okay. Now as he plans to ask his questions, I think we can go back to Professor Karim. Professor Baba, kindly respond to the two as we wait for the other questions.
Sorry, we can't hear Motola Olabumi.
Okay.
Maybe she'll come back online in a bit. So yes, the question of the place now occupied by IT and emerging media is extremely interesting and may change the face of the whole production of local intellectual activities. I think it already is doing. In some ways, this has been incredibly positive. It's opening up public space and space in which knowledge can be not only shared but recorded to many people who previously would not have had access to public space. And it's instant and it's of indefinitely wide reach. So you can create audiences internationally, globally. And it has also fostered a whole lot of new genres, new ways of writing and recording experience and memory, including historical memory. So in that way, similarly to desktop publishing in the 1980s and handheld video camera technology around the same time, it's made it possible for people to make public their knowledge and their understanding to many more people. That's very interesting, but I think we're all also aware that it is it has some downsides, one of which is a a kind of short-termism, a search for immediate impact, instant gratification. Memes circulate at great speed, but there's less incentive to spend 20 years painstakingly assembling obscure information. Less patience, really, with exploring questions in depth. As for artificial intelligence, the whole new scare that's taking on the airwaves about the way artificial intelligence will soon be ruling us instead of us ruling it, I think remains to be seen. Second question was about the relation of Professor Falola to Yoruba language and culture. I'm afraid the sound wasn't very clear when I was listening to this question, and I'm not quite sure what the question was getting at. And maybe we could actually invite Professor Falola to take the stage and tell us himself.
Thank you very much. Yes, I think ably answered. We really appreciate all that you have provided, for you have provided. I think Professor Toyin Falola is online. We'll be able to answer that. But in the meantime, let us have Professor Omotola Orubin Orubumi asking a question or making her remarks. We are sorry we cannot hear you. Put your mouthpiece on. Hello. Yeah, audio, please. Your audio is not clear. We can't hear you. We can see you, but we can't hear you. Please unmute.
He's not muted.
Yes. Please unmute. I think.
Maybe she could write the question in the chat.
Yes, please write the question on the chat. Before we go to Professor Falola. Just type in summary so that we can go back to Professor Falola for the end of the session. Yes, Professor Falola, you're welcome. And thank you for singing again. Thank you very much, Prof.
Thank you very much. I'm struggling.
You are well.
Kari, my health is not good because I'm recovering from stroke.
Oh.
I was just released from the hospital to participate.
Oh, sorry.
I'm struggling to talk.
You'll be really
one addition that I will make is that the terrain has actually expanded considerably to what we characterize as autobiographies and biographies. It's a lot now in Nigeria and elsewhere, as all these politicians and business people are writing. At the time, I collected over 200 of them. How we have to begin to study them. What Professor Baba covered around the issues of city histories, town histories, collective identities, ethnic and sub-ethnic identities. But the new sets of writing, they are using themselves. They're using themselves. So the individual represents the center of history. But in that center, some of the issues that ARCHAEOLOGY and others dealt with are woven into those individual projects as backgrounds to the making of the person. So in that making of the person, they fragment. The good news to those of us who study them is because they represent peasant success. So that peasant success creates an ideology that allows them to mobilize the histories of their towns. And because they must make up a story of how they become successful like magicians. And as magicians, they have to present the limitations of the early years. So we are very grateful. I'm very grateful that they are writing, and the projects are known, and I've encouraged many of them to write. Indeed, as I'm speaking to you, I'm encouraging 4 of them to publish. And where they influence me in shaping the project, I encourage them to write more about their places and their towns and cities, which is working very well. Then we have the categories of biographies, where they draw in our colleagues from the universities to write about them. So bottom line, in the case of Nigeria, virtually anybody who thinks himself to be successful is now writing something, which is good for us as scholars, that they are providing us with the data. I like the point about the interface between all these projects. Sometimes we struggle to label them. When I was in school, we were calling them chroniclers. That's what we were calling them. And when I was doing Yoruba Gurus, I struggled to create a name. And later on, Karim Baba created print media, or the category of works that are printed. So the nomenclature, and you could see in the conversation by our colleagues in Kenya, the labels and the nomenclatures, they use in sage philosophy and some other things. Sometimes we are referring to the same thing. And in the US, they use the word amateur because, the most distinguished of them all in the state of Texas is a guy called Weber. They even named one of the biggest chairs after him. We have a Weber faculty hall. He's doing exactly what ARCHAEOLOGY did. So maybe there's a need for a conversation on what we have to call this. We have to call them as the interface. Finally, I studied one of them, Ojo, and did a lot of interview, and he posed a question, a very fascinating question. And it's Professor Baba's comment on interface, which brings back this question to me. Ojo posed the question, why are they paying you, referring to me? And why are they not paying me, referring to himself? The reason is that he was not making a distinction between myself based at Ife, teaching history, and himself based at Shaki, just writing that history. And it took me a long time to reflect on that question. When Ayorinde, and I'm glad his son is doing very well. His son has a culture newspaper, Culture Media, who was also very distinguished writing. And because he was being invited at the University of Ibadan over and over again, like Fabumi at Ife, they began to wonder what were the differences between what we were doing and what they were doing, other than in the footnotes. In my early years, I dismissed them as being arrogant, but no, I will not dismiss them as arrogant anymore. Given their citation values, their relevance values. And as I began to relate, recently I was asked to write on Samuel Johnson by a group of scholars based in Germany, writing on this test. They got a contract to publish some of these tests. And when we relate Johnson to what scholars at Ibadan did, Samuel Johnson had already anticipated all their topics. He was the first of all, write about missionaries that Ajayi and Ayandele wrote. The project on the wall that Smith, Ajayi, and Akintoye wrote, without Samuel Johnson, it would not have been possible. And we need a project to actually look at the voices of Samuel Johnson and that of Akintoye, Revolution and Power Politics, is basically the same in terms of the fact that Akintoye also was now using the colonial archives. But their conclusions were basically so similar. So sometimes, not only was he anticipating us, the templates that they worked out. Amutabi in the morning was using a nomenclature that is the first time I will ever get that somebody is using it. And I'm very grateful for this conference for that. Amutabi was using the concept of plagiarism in the way we don't use it in the academy, which will get you into trouble. And in his presentation this morning, he used plagiarism 4 times. So in Amutabi's formulation, Ajayi Smith and Akintoye were plagiarizing Samuel Johnson. They will feel offended. They will certainly feel offended if we put it that way. But as Amutabi was talking, I began to say, this is making sense. If we make plagiarism far more elastic and not illegal, because we make it illegal, and Amutabi was using it in a legal framework. That he said he plagiarized peer, but he didn't mean it as doing something illegal. He means it in terms of the structure of writing. So somebody can plagiarize Karim Baba now in Amutabi's formulation, but that person in Amutabi's formulation is not doing something illegal. It's just borrowing ideologies and structures. So I think in that interface, Amutabi's formulation is opening a new set of conversation. What do we actually hold these people? And final point, to use Akinyele's book, Akinyele is far more believable in some ways than myself to the locals. And I will just illustrate. the way the Ibadan history is presented, they hate the city. This city was established around 1829. That is what I write about. But they don't believe that. You can never convince them about that. Although that is what the data tells us, that is what the fall of Oyo told us. But in their own narrative, that is not what they believe. What they believe is that the place has been there since 15th century forever. By a mythical figure called Lagelu, that's what they believe. But that's not what the archives says. That's not what academic historians say. So, because we knew people moved from Oyo Empire, the place collapsed. It wasn't dividing, people were there before, and they hate the history, and many of them hate the history, creating this mythical figure, which is now the icon of the city. So if I tell them, your city, you know, your city was created in the 19th century, as a scholar from the university, they will say that their city was not created in the 19th century. That's just a new formulation of their city. So thank you so much for bringing all this up. I wasn't expecting to talk. And I'm glad that our colleagues in Kenya are going to run with it, which is the brilliance of meetings like this. And I'm sorry, this is not my regular voice. I will regain it. I'm just thankful that I'm alive.
Thank you, Prof. Thank you very much, Professor Falola. You have every, you're actually a library of African history. Any topic, any issue that is raised, you are able to celebrate it with us in your 70th birthday. We are wishing you a very, very quick recovery. And from the look of things, you are almost there. Thank you. Now we want to appreciate the people who made this presentation really possible right now. The one that we are just ending the session. Number one is the presenter, and I think we can use the Nyayo. We had a president who had a style of clapping. Every time, 3 times, we used to clap for him. President Moi. So let's give her 3 Nyayo claps. We start. Now, for Diegon, our discussant, we give him 2. No, only 2. Then for the rest of us, for the chair and the rest of us, 1. Thank you very much. I call upon the program owner, Dr. Wafula, to tell us what we have to do after this. Thank you.
Good afternoon. It's unfortunate that when I stand here, I have to talk about time. Please excuse me because that's perhaps the only thing I want to talk about today. As the last day of the conference, we want to break for lunch. We are coming back for 2 parallel sessions, and we want to be very prompt with time. So I want to speak to the chairs of those sessions. There are 2. Dr. Mary Mugwe, I hope you've seen her around. And the rapporteur, Maluka, are you in? Yes, if you can have a quick grab of lunch and come back. I think I want you to start the session at exactly 2. If these guys will still be down, let's begin with the online team. Dr. Susan Mwangi, you are leading the 2nd parallel session. Where is Dr. Susan? I haven't seen her today. Well, we'll sort ourselves out. The rapporteur is Gabriel Nyabuto. Are you here? Nyabuto, you are here. Please take your time and let's come back. We will be having a wrap-up session and a brief closing ceremony from 4 p.m. Then thereafter, we'll have an invited dinner. We have just about 50 people who have been invited for dinner. So I don't know whether I'm going to throw a dice so that we see who falls within that 50 category. But I think we will have to leave from here at around 5 to Rosters Hotel, which is on Thika Road, for the 50. So I'll check with the list and know who is present and who is not there. I think over lunch hour, so that we can make things work out for all of us. For now, I think let's have a quick lunch of 40 minutes.